Ok. À, chào các bạn, chào mừng các bạn đã quay trở lại với sự kiện chia sẻ kiến thức về phúc lợi động vật được tổ chức bởi Phòng Phúc lợi động vật thuộc Tổ chức Động vật Châu Á. Thì đối với những bạn lần đầu tiên tham dự thì mình xin giới thiệu, đây là một chuỗi các buổi sự kiện chia sẻ kiến thức về phúc lợi động vật. Thì bọn mình đã cùng nhau tổ chức được rất nhiều những cái buổi chia sẻ khác nhau rồi. Thế nên là nếu như các bạn muốn xem lại thì các bạn có thể vào trên kênh YouTube của bọn mình, đó là Animal Welfare Team. Còn quay trở lại với buổi chia sẻ ngày hôm nay thì chúng ta sẽ đến với một chủ đề rất là đặc biệt và cũng rất là phức tạp. Đây là một chủ đề mà đã gây tranh cãi, đã và đang gây tranh cãi rất nhiều. Đó là về phúc lợi, đó là về việc sử dụng động vật trong thí nghiệm. Thì nếu như các bạn có câu hỏi gì thì các bạn có thể để lại trong phần hộp chat. Chúng ta sẽ có một buổi trả lời câu hỏi ngắn ở cuối chương trình. Thế nên là nếu như các bạn có câu hỏi gì thì các bạn hãy để lại trong một hộp chat nhé. Bây giờ chúng ta sẽ bắt đầu buổi chia sẻ ngày hôm nay. Nếu như buổi chia sẻ ngày hôm nay sẽ được phát dưới dạng video, thế nên là nếu như các bạn có bị giật khi xem trên Zoom thì các bạn có thể xem trên kênh YouTube của bọn mình có livestream trên đấy thì chất lượng sẽ mượt hơn. Mình sẽ gửi link YouTube ở trong phần hộp chat nhé.
Hello, I'm Dave Neal, the Animal Welfare Director for Animals Asia Foundation, and today I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to the use and some of the issues with the use of animals in research. So firstly, why are animals used in research? Well, there are a number of reasons. We use animals to gain basic biological knowledge, to know more about how the body works, how all the organs work within the body of those animals, and then to relate that to people, to discover and also then to develop new drugs and new treatments for illnesses, to develop things like new vaccines, but also to then test the safety of those drugs and those vaccines that we're developing, as well as to test the safety of chemicals or products which we're going to buy ourselves to ensure that they're safe for people to either consume or to use. They're used in environmental research, again, to test their impact on the environment and also upon ourselves. And the use in education and in training. So animals use in research is used for things such as in teaching practices for doctors, but also for vets and medical staff. To get an idea of just how many animals are used, then that's actually very difficult for us to know. The Cruelty Free International, which is an organisation which is campaigning to stop the use of animals in research, is estimated that in 2015 there were at least 192 million animals which were used for scientific purposes all over the world. Now, it's very difficult to estimate these numbers because not every country is actually documenting and giving that data and making that data available. And not all of these animals were actually experimented upon. So some of them will be used for breeding to produce more animals so that they can then be used in experimentation. But still, the number is obviously a very high number, over 190 million animals as an estimate. And that was 7 years ago in 2015. Just in general, what species are being used in research. So there's a whole host of different types of animals which are used for research. Many of the rodents, rats and mice, guinea pigs, rabbits, and also dogs and cats, and the primates, as well as farmed animals, pigs and sheep, and also large numbers of fish and also reptiles and amphibians. As you can see from this diagram on the screen, the animals used in experiments back in 2008, which again is quite a long time ago, but it shows that the majority of those animals, actually, in this case, 59% of animals were mice, which were being used for experimental purposes in this case. So research within the European Union, estimates from 2017 suggest that 10.9 million experiments were conducted on animals across the whole of the European Union, with a further 12.6 million animals being bred and subsequently killed, but not being used in experiments. So again, we can see the numbers are particularly high. And it's estimated that just 20% of those experiments, of nearly 11 million experiments, were actually required by the regulator, which means that the majority of experiments were not actually essential experiments to conduct. They were not required by law for whatever the experiment was looking into, whatever it was testing. And also, as is the case, many of these experiments actually have very valid non-animal alternatives, which have already been established, but researchers continue to insist upon using the animals as the model. In the USA, then figures from 2017-2018 suggesting that there were over 111 million mice which were being used in experiments. Now, the US government reported just 797,000 animals, but this is because animals such as rats and mice and fish do not come under the Animal Welfare Act in America, so therefore they do not need to be reported. So their use goes unreported in the official statistics. A further 137,000 being bred, not used in research. And again, these figures are way, way lower than the actual number, because again, they're not including the majority of the animals which are being used in research, the rats and the mice and the fish. And then research in China, in recent years, the number of animals in China being used in medical research for experimental purposes is rising. We now estimate that it'd be somewhere between 12 and 13 million animals. And it's rising because as the environment becomes more restrictive for companies to do their research in certain countries like the UK or across the European Union, then often that is outsourced to other countries, and in many cases that's outsourced to China. So whilst we are seeing an increase in the regulation and the restrictions in some countries, it doesn't mean that research doesn't happen. It just means it moves the location to another country. In addition, China also breeds a lot of animals for research. In particular, breeds a lot of primates, in this case mainly macaques, and it's estimated that they export 40,000 laboratory primates, so macaques which are then going to be used in experiments to other countries. Now, the types of animal testing can be classified into three different types. The first really is what would be called the basic biological research, and this is the most common use. And this is to answer those scientific questions which are thought might be useful for humans and developing of human medicine. It does not involve testing new medicines that are not required by law. Now, the type of experimentation for this is very vast. So it can be things like the picture here, where it's separating young infants from their mothers to see what impact that has on them. And this is an experiment which has been done for decades now and unfortunately continues to try to look at this, just how stressful it is on the physiology and the mental capacities of animals when they're not actually being raised in the natural way. Incredibly cruel experiments, and the individuals which are involved suffer greatly. But also, it can be just testing things like damaging certain organs in animals so that we can test the response of drugs upon them, or how that animal is impacted by that damage, and all kinds of things which again are likely to cause animals a significant amount of pain and suffering, and in many cases would produce very few results which could be useful. There was one particular case. Now, this was from 2013. There was an investigation into the Max Planck Institute in Germany, which was using macaques for brain and vision experiments. And these macaques were subjected to many different procedures, many having major brain surgery, and having devices implanted into their skulls, and many being left with particularly terrible injuries that were becoming infected. And a lot of these animals were restrained, as you can see, in these absolutely inhumane methods for many hours. Many were left in conditions where they were left with very little food, very little water, socially isolated, and a huge amount of pain and suffering, with almost no gain to from these experiments. But again, this is that general sort of biological basic research to try in the hope of producing some information which can potentially be useful to produce maybe new drugs or to treat human ailments. Another type of testing is genetic modification, so genetically modifying animals. So this is breeding animals with very specific genes, either removed or actually inserting genes into the body so that an animal grows a certain type of disease. And obviously that can have a detrimental impact on the animal, and obviously puts the animals under a huge amount of stress, because its usual biological processes are not happening with having an impact directly on the animal before it's been born, so that it starts to actually grow something which is going to be detrimental for it. It's going to be unhealthy for the animal, so that we can then look at that process ourselves. So the whole process of genetic modification has a whole number of issues, right the way from egg production all the way through to the animals being killed. So often the females are induced to ovulate. This can be an incredibly stressful process. Then they're mated, and then often when they're no longer needed, the eggs are removed. Then they might be killed, and those eggs then may be implanted into another animal, ensuring that this modification is present. There's a huge amount of mortality involved in this process. A lot of youngsters which are being born and are dying. There's a lot of premature births or animals which are dying before they're being born, and actually causing a major amount of suffering both to the individual, the young animals, but also to the parent animals as well. Many of these animals then go through highly invasive procedures. So taking small parts of the body away from them for genotype testing, which is going to cause a huge amount of pain and suffering if it's done without any anesthetic, which it often is. And then at the end of their lives, and these animals are killed, like the majority of other experimental animals. And so with genetic modification, then there's a huge number of animals which are being used, being bred and being killed without actually having any benefit or producing any results which are beneficial to people. And then the third type of testing is what we know as the regulatory testing. So standardized testing to see whether medicines or chemicals, cosmetics are safe for us to use, and they're doing what they should be doing. And this is something which a lot of us are quite aware of. But the types of regulatory testing that are done often have non-human. don't have animal alternatives at the moment, and so they continue to be used. And this is where we need to look at changing that situation to ensure that these tests can be eradicated, because they are highly stressful and cause a huge amount of pain and suffering. So things such as forcing animals to eat certain substances or inhale certain chemicals, or actually physically putting those chemicals onto the skin of animals or into the eyes of animals, or injecting them into the bodies of animals. You can see here, this is going to cause animals a huge amount of pain and suffering. And we often see these images of rabbits, which are often being used for chemical testing or cosmetic testing, where substances are being put into the eyes, or they're having part of the skin shaved and then the substances rubbed onto the skin to see what happens. And these animals might be subject to these conditions for many, many hours, restrained in these terrible, awful restrainers, socially isolated from each other, and subjected to a huge amount of pain. And then there's the cosmetic testing as well. And this again is using animals to test cosmetics. And this, what I would say, is a wholly unjustifiable on an ethical basis, because whilst we can argue that some of the testing for medicines will potentially produce results which are useful for humans, then this is really just for producing things such as cosmetics, which is for human vanity, and therefore are just not needed. And so huge numbers of animals suffer, and animals are still being used in tests for cosmetics in 80% of the world. So the majority of the world is still using animals for cosmetic testing, even though it's been outlawed in some countries. And animals are also used to test new ingredients, which are being used in cosmetics or in household products, which we use for cleaning products or deodorants or whatever, which we use around products that we're using within our homes. And again, this is causing a major amount of suffering and should be and can be eliminated. A recent example from America, in 2019, an undercover investigation was carried out on one of the world's largest contract research organizations, which was using dogs to test a variety of substances for their levels of toxicity. And in some cases, then these animals were having their stomachs opened and these chemicals put into their stomachs to see what their impact they would have upon them. Often the animals were being kept isolated. In some cases, they were being kept isolated for about a year before the animals was actually killed. And things testing such as fungicides and pesticides. And again, it was shown that these experiments were incredibly damaging to the animals, incredibly cruel, and the conditions which the animals were being kept in was incredibly cruel as well. Unfortunately, this was being exposed as something which was unnecessary, and hopefully that starts to lead us down to the end of these type of experiments, and to push the researchers and the companies which are involved in producing these substances into looking towards developing alternatives. So as well as the welfare problems of actually experimenting upon animals, there are also other issues which we need to consider when we're looking at the use of animals in research. One of those is actually the impact of the way that we keep animals, research animals, the impact of their housing. So housing systems, they're often designed to keep costs low, to be easy to clean, so it's easy maintenance, and for researchers to have very regular access to those animals. So many animals are then kept in these, what we would say, are grossly inadequate environments. So either social animals, which are being singly housed, which is going to cause them a significant amount of stress because they are a social animal, or animals which are group housed, but housed in very small conditions, so that actually, again, although they might have some social contact, there's going to be some stress there because there's competition for things such as resources, which is likely to lead to fights between individuals and further injuries. So animals often kept in these very poor conditions for our convenience, so that we can access those animals much easier, rather than put them in an extensive environment, which is much more difficult for us to get to those animals, to access those animals, to be able to use them. There's also a very negative impact of handling. So routine handling is very stressful for laboratory animals. Mice, for example, they don't get used to this process. They don't become habituated to it. They're often being picked up by their tails, as you can see through these examples, and they actually become more sensitive to that process. So it becomes very fearful for them that this process is going to happen. So the animals is in a constant stress and fearful situation, due to the fact that it knows that when people are in the room, they're going to handle these animals in these ways. And for animals such as primates, so the handling can be more stressful, because it can actually be very dangerous for the researchers. So as a result, primates are often much more forcefully restrained for procedures which require any sort of interaction. So as you can imagine, they're either forcefully restrained by people, if they're moving them from one place to another, or they're put into restrainers, or they're actually in cages which will are like a crush cage, so that rather than the handler having to take the animal out, it will crush the animal into a corner so the animal can't move, and then whatever experimentation is going to happen will be done on the animal in that situation. As you can imagine, it's highly stressful, and particularly holding animals in these sort of head restrainer devices must be incredibly stressful for these animals. There's also impact of things like identification, particularly for animals which are housed in groups. So it may be that you're looking at trying to see the impact of certain research, certain administration of drugs onto certain individuals, and then with those animals are being housed with other individuals, so you can't just label the cage and say this individual has received this treatment. So often then animals need to be identifiable, and this can be done through removing parts of the skin, often removing parts of the ear, which again can be incredibly painful for those animals, which is when it's done without the use of anaesthetics. And then, of course, at the end of their usefulness, either as an experimental animal, a research animal, or as a breeding animal, or it's decided that particular animals are no longer needed, then these animals will be euthanized. Some of those animals will be euthanized during experimentation, so maybe they'll be anaesthetized during the experimentation and then euthanized, but many others, unfortunately, will end up being gassed, and often the use of carbon dioxide gas is as one of the most large numbers of animals like this. And unfortunately, that is incredibly stressful for the animals, and is likely to cause them a significant amount of pain and suffering before those animals die. So many of these animals have already gone through a very stressful life, and then end up being killed in a painful and stressful way. In recent years, there's been some attempts to look towards rehoming animals. Again, this is done on a very small scale, but for some animals that have been used in experimentations, particularly ones which aren't so invasive, then there is a possibility for rehoming animals, particularly companion animals like dogs and cats and rabbits. And this is beginning to happen, but there certainly does need to be more of this, so that some of those animals at least then can end up at least in a situation where they can live a better quality of life. And animal research also has an impact on wildlife trade as well. So whilst most of the animals being used for research are captive bred, so rodents and fish and dogs and cats and etc., there is some cases where wild animals, in particular monkeys and macaques, are actually being taken from the wild and then traded for research. So there's currently a lot of investigation into certain countries, particularly in Indonesia, where there are macaques which may be being seen as having a negative impact on human settlements, and therefore there is an export quota for these animals to be captured and then to be exported. And so therefore this can have an impact on the numbers in the wild. And regardless if those animals are being either wild caught or in the majority of cases captive bred, then the way that those animals are being treated is often causing them additional stress and suffering. So in many cases, young animals in particular being bred and then being removed from their mothers at a very young age, which is then going to cause a huge amount of stress, often animals being socially isolated as well. Again, particularly for highly social animals, this is going to be very stressful indeed. There are some initiatives to try to minimize the amount of pain and suffering that research animals go through, and the most famous one was developed back in the 1950s, 1959, and it's called the 3 R's. And this is to try to is replacement, reduction, and refinement. So replacing animals' experiments, obviously, with alternative methods which don't involve animals is particularly important. Reducing the number of animals that are being used, so trying to prevent the repetition of experiments which have already been done, trying to make sure that experiments that are done in a valid way so that the results can be used and it doesn't become a waste. If something doesn't happen during the experiment, which then means that all of that research is no longer valid and therefore it has to start again. But also trying to refine those experiments as well, to try to minimize the stress and the pain caused to those individual animals. So this is something which at least is very much part of the research community and is being promoted more so in some areas than others, but it's good that it exists, and it existed for a long time, to at least make an attempt to minimize the amount of pain and suffering being caused from animals to produce the results which are the results which the researchers are looking for. Actually, in the UK, then we actually have a national centre for the replacement, refinement, and reduction of animals in research, and this is a real big step forward, because that's looking at not just experimentation in the UK but across the world, and again trying to achieve all of this, trying to reduce the number of animals, refine the experimentation, replace animals where possible. And then internationally, there is also what we call the Leaping Bunny program. This is looking at mainly the cosmetics and the household products. And this is a system which has over 1,000 products on it. And as the products have been investigated to show that they have no impact upon the welfare of animals during the research. So the animals are not being used in the development of these products. And again, that has a big way of reducing the amount of animal suffering, particularly for cosmetic and household products, because us as consumers can then look for this Leaping Bunny symbol on the product, and we can be confident that those products that we're buying are have not been produced by causing animal suffering in the research phase. So then, just looking at some of the legislative and requirements and the regulations, the UK has had the Animal Scientific Procedures Acts in place since 1986. It was amended in 2012, and that actually has some of the most stringent legislation in place to try to minimize suffering. It defines levels of suffering, and it means that somebody who is looking for a license to carry out experiments on animals has to define what level of suffering that experiment is going to cause, and therefore it would depend on whether the regulator feels it's necessary, if it's going to cause an extreme amount of suffering, whether it's actually necessary or not, to whether they get the license or not. In the EU, there's an EU directive which has been active since 2010, and this governs animal use for scientific purposes. And it's the current legislation is based upon the 3Rs, and it's the only directive actually in the world that has this goal of completely replacing the use of animals for scientific purposes. So whilst millions of animals are still used in the European Union, there is some hope there that there is a real drive from the European Union, from the Commission, to try to continue to develop these alternatives and to eventually eradicate the use of animals in experimentation, and that's within the legislation. There is less legislation again in countries like China, as I mentioned earlier. Up until recently, then there was really just guidelines. So in 2018, China adopted the guidelines on the welfare and ethical review for laboratory animals, but again, these were non-legally binding. And up until recently, then all of the cosmetics that were being sold in China had to be tested on animals, and this changed quite recently. So in 2021, some cosmetics, not all, are now exempt from routine animal testing requirements, which is a really good thing, because obviously it meant that products which had already maybe gone through a process of not being tested on animals, because other countries like the UK and countries in the European Union were able to sell those products without being tested on animals, suddenly then if they wanted to sell those products in China, would then having to be tested on animals for no reason, because we knew they were already safe on humans. So fortunately that process seems to be changing, but the legislation for the use of animals in China seriously needs to be improved, because at the moment it's nothing like some of the legislation in other countries, yet the number of animals that are being used continues to grow. And then for the United States, I mentioned earlier, the Animal Welfare Act, which is a federal law, it covers animals in research, but it actually excludes around 95% of the animals that are actually being tested on. So there is actually no protection whatsoever for rodents and birds and fish within the Animal Welfare Act, and it provides minimal protection for the rest of the animals. So this is something which seriously needs to be addressed and to be changed, because at the moment then there isn't any regulations. There are some minimum standards for research, for minimum standards for the way that animals need to be housed, and for pain control as well. So it's not completely null and void in terms of its impact, but ultimately it still has a lot to do to ensure that animals are not suffering for research. And then going from a cosmetics point of view again, the European Union, India, Israel, Brazil, South Korea, New Zealand and Turkey have all now adopted full or partial animal testing, and in some cases sales restrictions on the sales of cosmetics that have been tested on animals. And the UK has also banned the testing of household chemicals on animals as well. So this legislation is beginning to come in other countries. We say it's starting back in the UK back in 1998 was the first country to ban cosmetic testing. The European Union brought in something similar back in 2009, but now we're seeing it in other countries, both in Asia and in South America, as well as in Europe. So just briefly then, what is the case against the use of animals in research? Well, we know there are huge welfare issues. We've highlighted some of them already. There are huge welfare issues in terms of the way that animals are bred, the way that animals are being housed, the way that animals are then being used, which is causing them a huge amount of pain and suffering. There are ethical considerations to whether we have the right to carry out those experiments on those animals. Do we have the right to actually inflict this degree of pain and suffering on sentient animals to produce for our own benefits? And in many cases, unfortunately, not producing any benefit for us whatsoever. They are not they do not provide a reliable model. So 90% of the drugs fail when they go to human trials, even when they're past the animal tests. And they're failing on things like safety grounds, so they're not safe for human consumption, or just they're not effective. So they've shown some effectiveness in an animal study, but they don't show that effectiveness in the human study. And often this is because of this process, this ADME process, it varies greatly. And this is the way that chemicals are absorbed in the body, the way that they're distributed in the body, the way that they're then metabolized and processed in the body, and the way that they're eliminated out of the body varies greatly from species to species. So therefore, it's not easy to be able to extrapolate the results to say these chemicals, these drugs, these medicines, this vaccine has had this impact on this type of animal, it will therefore have this impact on humans. And as we see, then in the majority of cases, 90% of drugs are failing. So that's a huge amount of wasted lives, a huge number of animals which are being inflicted or being subjected to very cruel treatment and invasive procedures to produce results which, again, are not really producing the results that we need in the quantities that we're looking for. They can prove dangerous. There are a number of examples of drugs which have gone through animal trials without any major safety concerns from the researchers, and then they've gone into human trials and they've caused serious medical problems for people. And so again, this comes down to that fact that they're being tested on a completely different species. And they're also expensive, because to have these animals, to have these laboratories, to keep these animals for long periods of time is expensive. It's an expensive process, and it's time consuming. It takes a long time to be able to develop something. So it's very costly process and a very inefficient process. Here's now a video which is going to explain some of that in a little bit more detail.
So we all live different lifestyles. Some of us smoke, some of us drink, some of us eat too much. And that all affects the biology of the person who has cancer. We really don't have the animal models to fine-tune all those different biologies that we see in the human. And actually to do it by animal research would be very, very expensive. And we've had to do it in the past, and animals have been very valuable for developing some cancer therapies. But we're reaching a time when we need to start thinking outside the box and developing better human-related models, because after all, it's humans we treat in the clinic. It's not mice.
There are certainly limitations in using rodents. A recent study has identified literally millions of small genetic differences between different highly inbred strains of mice. The problem I have is that I don't know which strain of mice having which particular genetic variation will actually translate functionally to humans. That's why we have to study human tissues, to translate and understand the value or lack of value of these animal studies.
Mice have an entirely different anatomy in terms of their lungs and the way that they breathe compared to people. So it's really difficult to use a mouse to model a respiratory disease that happens in people. So a cystic fibrosis mouse does not spontaneously develop the lung disease that a person with cystic fibrosis does.
It's very hard to create an animal model that even equates closely to what we're trying to achieve in the human. My research is studying how the brain and central nervous system works, in particular epilepsy. And the other aspect of my research is to look at pain. It's something about human neurodevelopment, human growth, the way the brain develops as you grow, and how that might be changing in some of our patients that is the key. So studying animals where you've created epilepsy and trying to equate that to a human who has developed atypically as a human isn't a good model.
So we are restricted in some of the things we can do, which is why we've had to rely on animals in the past. But there's no doubt about it, those models are not as good as having access to the human models.
Our motivation is not necessarily to replace animals. That's an amazing spin-off. Our motivation is to improve the quality of science for human health. If we wanted to improve the science for a mouse, we would study just mice. We don't. We're in this to study human and to benefit human health. What we try and focus on is the use of human isolated tissues. We get those tissues from surgery. The patient consents. We team up with the surgeons and pathologists, and we bring those tissues fresh and alive here to the laboratory.
That enables us to understand the biology of the cancer that has literally been removed from the patient a few minutes earlier. So it gives us a very good snapshot in what's actually going on in the biology that we're trying to treat in the clinic. We're not trying to cure mice in clinic, we're trying to cure humans. We need more humans to be willing to donate for tissue banking, but we need to start having that public engagement talk with people and explaining more why we need access to human material and asking people's permission.
My research overcomes the limitations of animal research because we can specifically develop these different disease models. We can use cells from people with cystic fibrosis to make cystic fibrosis airways. We can use cells from people with asthma to make asthmatic airways. And we can use cells from people that have smoked to see what the damage they've done to their airways might look like when we transfer it into the lab. We can't do that in animals. We can't make an asthmatic mouse. It doesn't happen. It's really, really complicated, and the asthmatic mouse doesn't have asthma symptoms like we would recognise it in people.
So because of the kind of differences between rodents and humans, for example, it's absolutely essential to validate both molecular and functional studies using human tissues. And that's increasingly so in today's world, where, if you like, we've picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of research, and we're digging into areas of unknown science. And who can say if that will mean the same in a rat or a mouse and human? That's why it's important to cut your risk and go straight for human.
These techniques, neuroimaging, for example, has already had a large impact in the way in which medical research is undertaken. Critically importantly, if you want to understand human mental illness, it's a uniquely human condition. Depression, Alzheimer's disease, is something that will only be achieved by studying those patients. There are often treatments and therapies that will work very well in the animal model. When you come to apply them to the human subject, they fail. It's the interspecies difference which is often the key factor here.
I think it's really time that we move towards replacing animals in research. I think animals have been held up far too long as a gold standard for research, as what we should be doing and what we can learn from them. And to me, there's far too much propaganda about how fantastic animal research is. And actually, there's a lot of human research that's being done. There's a lot of animal replacement research, which is, it's better, it's more relevant, and it's going to take us into the future more effectively than using these outdated animal models.
Well, of course, we study human functions for the benefit of human health. Rats, mice, and so on can't necessarily do that. So we can study things that do not exist in rodents. We can show that, for example, we've just looked at a particular drug that's in clinical trials that is said to have one action in a rat and mouse, but we test it in humans, it has a different action. So we can save a lot of money in that way.
It's difficult to get funding to support the key areas of the clinical side that we need to help us, for example, pathology. So I'd be very keen to see the government putting more money into pathology departments, and so I think that would be extremely important if that could be done.
For people that are truly interested in replacing animals, the funding we have to apply for is all charity-based. and that is obviously never going to put us in the position where we can be world leaders in this kind of research.
If the government invested strategically in alternatives for medical research, and we're looking at very significant investment to make a difference, the impact on medical research, I believe, would be very, very significant.
So we need to be investing now for something that's going to pay dividends in 10 years' time. And that investment needs to be appropriately tailored, it needs to be directed to the right place, and we need to find new paradigms for disease. Now, that will probably mean moving away from the animal model, which some people may find difficult, but who are we trying to cure here? Is it the mouse or is it man?
I think Horizon 2020 is a perfect opportunity now to use the three tenets of Horizon 2020 as I see it, which is excellent science. This is what we're doing in replacing animals, replacing outdated historical models that don't work with much better, more improved human models. We are showing innovation in our techniques because we have to show innovation to be able to move this forward and to be able to use it. And we're showing that we care about society.
We cannot mimic elderly research that well in animals. We need to start thinking about how we're going to get the information we need to treat our elderly population, whether that's cancer, dementia, it doesn't really matter. Modelling that in animals is not easy. The animal model is very imperfect in those areas, so we have to think clever and we have to invest now for the sake of me when I'm older, when I'm retired. I'm going to need medicines like that, and the next generation is certainly going to need it because they will live even longer than us.
I don't think animal research is going to get us where we need to be. And I don't think animal research is going to be the future. It's people that get these diseases, it's people that need these treatments, and the scientists need to be using better models of people in order to develop these better cures for people.
We're seeing an increased number of scientific studies being published, which are demonstrating that animal models from mice to monkeys are simply not producing results that are relevant to human health. So whether we're looking at asthma, Alzheimer's, cancer, multiple sclerosis, we're seeing decades of research, millions of animals, and often billions of very scarce healthcare resources that are simply not producing the results, the treatments and cures that we all want to see. Humane Society International is a science-driven organization, and we're working around the world, leading in many cases the transition from animal testing, animal research, to modern human biology-based approaches. We work with governments, with industry, hand in hand, to move away from outdated approaches to more humane and more relevant and more effective, ultimately, testing and research models.
So hopefully a good summary of some of the issues that we talked about problems of using animals in research, and also touching on some of those alternatives to the use of animals in research as well. So just briefly to finish off, there are a number of different alternatives which are available. So the growth, the development of called 3D cells, so actually growing cells, culturing cells, so then they can actually be used for as human tissues. Growing organs, actually small replicas of our own organs onto tiny little microchips is something which is now very much being used, and some of these examples will be explained a little more in the final video after this slide. Using human tissues, as referenced in the video a moment ago, so actually taking tissue samples from people with the diseases that we're trying to find cures for, and then using those in our experiments, which is going to have much more impact. They're going to be much more effective because you're actually looking at the problems on a human, on an actual person. And computer modeling, so developing these computer models of organs and then putting them through these testing regimes of putting various drugs into those computer models to see what the impact is, but also using computers and data, huge amount of data which can be mined and analysed using computer models to try to look for trends across the world in terms of what certain things are impacting upon the people getting certain illnesses or developing certain diseases. The use of human volunteers as well, so humans can volunteer to actually be tested on. It's not done obviously in the same way that we do with animals. We do without their consent, obviously, and we give them often highly lethal doses. And for humans, then there is an ethical consideration there, and often it's done with micro dosing, so very, very small amounts, which are not going to have a harmful impact, but looking at the impact upon those volunteers. And then there's also things like simulators, so human patient simulators which are being developed, so simulations of the human body which you can then put through various processes, and you can and they react in the same way that a human body is likely to react, and you can observe that within an experimental situation. I say just a final video then, which talks a little bit more about those alternatives which are available and need to be continued to be developed.
This is the idea of replacing animal studies for drug testing, for example, with little micro-engineered devices that are lined by human cells and reconstitute organ-level functions.
One of the things that pharmaceutical industry is finding is that they're having very high failure rates, and often it's because the animal models being used to develop these drugs are not predictive of the human situation.
It's very expensive to perform animal studies and also time-consuming.
Whereas here we have models that can potentially better predict the human situation.
It's called human breathing lung on a chip, and this device mimics a breathing human lung.
It has human airway cells from the air sac on a membrane that's porous. On the other side of the membrane are human capillary blood vessel cells. There's air on one side, there's flowing medium with human blood cells in it, like blood on the other side, on the capillary side, and then the whole thing stretches and relaxes just like our lung does when we breathe.
And we mimic, various types of physiological responses to drugs, toxins, or various types of materials we encounter on a daily basis.
So this would be very useful because it's human relevant, because we will be using human cells.
And I think the beauty of this technology is so easy and straightforward that a lot of people can use it without getting trained, especially biologists, clinicians, chemists, who don't have any engineering background. This technology is accessible to them.
Much cheaper than using animal models. To see the size, you need very little compound. So this would not only be more predictive, but have higher turnaround times. You can screen using much smaller amounts of the drugs too. So more predictive and more practical.
But we also have kidney on a chip, bone marrow on a chip, peristalsis gut on a chip, and we're just going on organ to organ and hopefully integrating them in a little microsystem. We link the heart that beats to the lung that breathes. We're getting great interest from pharmaceutical industry and hope to announce our first alliance to use those to see if we can indeed replace some animal studies to accelerate the drug development process and decrease costs.
This institute is by far the greatest and best working environment for bioengineering research, and we can predict the behavior or response of these cells or the body to, for example, drugs more precisely. I think that's where the promise is.
So some good examples there of practical example of an alternative which is already under development. And then finally, there are governments which are supporting the development of alternatives. So we've gone past that stage now of needing to recognise that we need to do something about animals in experimentation, and governments, particularly in the UK, Denmark, Brazil, Germany, and the USA, all have research programs which are already developing alternative technologies or are supporting the development of alternative technologies. So we can hope that because they're now beginning to see this support from particularly within Europe and the Americas, then we'll start to see these alternatives be properly funded as they should be, and therefore start to have a much bigger impact, because as we can see from what we've heard, then they're very much likely to be much more effective and be less costly than some of the use of animals. So can we replace animals? Well, replacing animal tests with non-animal alternatives is good for us. It's obviously very good for the animals. The issue of using animals in experimentation is a highly controversial one. There are obviously drugs which have been developed which are beneficial to us. There are vaccines which have been developed which are beneficial to us that have gone through animal testing and gone through animal testing for the regulatory requirements for them to be on the market for us to be able to consume, to be able to help us to survive certain illnesses and ailments. That doesn't mean that those drugs couldn't have been created or couldn't have been developed without the use of animals. And that's where we are with this debate, really. It's not that the use of, we are saying that all animal experimentation is useless. Of course it isn't. The huge part of it, a large majority of it, doesn't produce results, but obviously the results that are produced are incredibly beneficial to human survival and trying to allow some people to live with very debilitating diseases. And that's something which, you know, is not something that we want to go back and change. What we do want is to look forward and to say, for the continuation of development, we now need to improve this process. It needs to be streamlined. There are these incredible alternative technologies which are out there. They need to be invested upon. Governments need to recognize them and stop saying that they have that certain drugs have to go through these animal testing procedures to be regulated and to allow to be used within their country. And that's the position that we're in. We need that investment and that commitment from more governments around the world to ensure that these alternatives come on board as quickly as possible and we can end the use of animals in experimentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you found the topic useful, and it's an introduction to the topic, so please feel free to look further into this, because it's an incredibly complex topic and it impacts all of us, but ultimately it's currently negatively impacting over 190 million animals every year. And we feel that many of those animals' lives could be spared if we all work towards the development and the use of alternatives to the use of animals in experimentation. Thank you.
Vậy là chúng ta đã vừa xem xong video chia sẻ về việc sử dụng động vật trong thí nghiệm. Thì đây thực sự là một cái chủ đề rất là khó và phức tạp, đúng không ạ? Thì bây giờ nếu như bây giờ chúng ta sẽ đến với phần câu hỏi. Nếu như các bạn có câu hỏi gì thì các bạn có thể để lại trong phần hộp chat để chúng ta có thể trao đổi với diễn giả ngày hôm nay nhé. Hi Dev. Okay, you can unmute.
Hi Hung, hi everybody.
Hi, thank you for joining. Animal use in research is really complicated topic, and through your presentation, I'm pretty sure that everyone in this room now will have gained a lot of new knowledge, and so now we're gonna move to the Q&A section, and we already have some, and Thanh will help me to give it to you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So we have the first question, is that if animal testing is a way that is more expensive and less effective than the alternative solutions that we are currently having, why do researchers and governments still using like animals or requiring to use animal in their research? Is this a belief from the past that animals testing is better than testing on models?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a difficult one to answer. And I think the person who's put the question has already answered it, because I do, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not an expert in this particular field, but I think it is just the fact that it's something that we've always done. And so it's now very much embedded in the culture of developing new medicines. And so therefore, at the moment, or most governments or governments around the world actually are still saying that we need to test these products on animals before they come for use in humans. And that's the challenge, is to change that, because it's being shown that it can be less expensive and much less intrusive, obviously, from an animal point of view, to do these things. And the results are likely to produce much more results for the money which is invested.
Cảm ơn câu hỏi của bạn, và đây là một cái câu hỏi rất là thú vị, rất là hay, và bạn nào đưa ra câu hỏi này thì có lẽ cũng đã đưa ra một phần cái câu trả lời trong cái câu hỏi của bạn rồi, bởi vì là đúng là có những cái nghiên cứu và những cái bằng chứng cho thấy rằng là cái việc sử dụng các sản phẩm thay thế cho động vật sống nó có hiệu quả hơn và nó rẻ hơn rất nhiều. Tuy nhiên là rất nhiều cái chính phủ hay là các cơ quan nghiên cứu họ vẫn sử dụng động vật sống, và đó có thể là như bạn nói, nó là một cái vấn đề mà từ trước nay người ta vẫn làm như vậy, và người ta chưa có một cái động lực hay chưa có một cái hướng đi mạnh dạn để thay thế. Thì đây là một cái mà vấn đề mà có lẽ là chúng ta cần phải chung tay để thay đổi cái vấn đề, cái nhận thức đó.
But that is the real challenge, I guess, for organizations which are specifically working on this, like Humane Society International, is to convince the governments around the world to start to accept the alternative approaches. And once that does start to happen, then I think we'll move into a completely different area where we'll start to see progress without the use of animals, and that progress coming at a much lower cost financially than is currently happening.
Tuy nhiên là chúng tôi cũng thừa nhận rằng là đây là một cái vấn đề rất là khó khăn trong việc thuyết phục các cái chính phủ cũng như là các doanh nghiệp họ chuyển đổi cho việc sử dụng cái phương án thay thế cho thí nghiệm trên động vật, và đứng từ phía các cái góc độ các tổ chức phi chính phủ nữa thì cũng là một cái thách thức rất là lớn, và chúng tôi hy vọng rằng là những cái nỗ lực như các tổ chức Humane Society International, tổ chức nhân đạo quốc tế họ đang làm thì trong việc vận động những cái chính sách như thế này, thì nó khi mà tạo ra sự thay đổi thì nó là một cái bước tiến rất là lớn, và nó có khả năng là mang lại những cái thay đổi mang tính tương lai và tính cách mạng đối với cái loài động vật được sử dụng trong những cái thí nghiệm đó. Thank you, Dave. We come to the second question. There's someone who said he or she have read information that said that we share 95% of our genes with mouse and 97 to 98% with macaques. So with that, why do animals testing results is different when we use on humans?
Yes, that is good. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, the percentages. I know we do share a huge amount of our genetic material with a number of mammals, but still the way, I think it comes down to that ADME, which is the absorption, the distribution, the metabolism, and then the extraction of the materials from the body still happens differently in different species. And so, yes, we are gaining useful information from some of those studies, but also the information doesn't always transmit directly from an animal into a human. And I just think, that is evident from the fact that from the research is telling us that 90% of these experimentations are not producing quality, good results or new drugs which are treating people. So we're still only getting results from, say, 10%. So I think even though we are genetically similar, our bodies are still operating very differently, and our reactions to drugs is very differently between species. In fact, sorry, translate.
Mà nói chung là bản thân tôi thì cũng không thể nhớ được hết các cái con số chính xác tỷ lệ phần trăm là bao nhiêu giữa loài người đối với các loài khác. Tuy nhiên là chúng ta, con loài người đúng là có chia sẻ cái tỷ lệ phần trăm khá là cao về vật liệu gen giống nhau đối với một số cái loài động vật. Tuy nhiên là như đã trình bày thì cái sự khác biệt là giữa các loài với nhau nó có những cái sự khác biệt về cái cách thức mà chúng ta hấp thụ một cái vật chất, ví dụ như cái chất hóa học nào đó và chuyển hóa nó và đào thải những chất hóa học đó, thì cái cơ thể những cái quá trình này diễn ra khác nhau ở các cái cơ thể khác nhau, đặc biệt là các cái loài khác nhau, thì cái quá trình đó nó diễn ra càng khác biệt nữa. Do đó là vì vậy đây là những cái lý do chính khiến cho có tới chỉ hơn 90%, có tới 90% các cái thí nghiệm mà có thể gọi là thành công trên động vật hoặc là an toàn trên động vật, nhưng mà lại không hiệu quả ở con người, và chỉ số còn lại chỉ khoảng 10% thôi.
And I think if we were to switch to the use of alternatives, so non-animal alternatives, all of the things that were just being discussed in that last video, then we would start to see that percentage increase quite significantly, so that the majority of the results which are coming out from that kind of experimentation would have some significance and would lead to development of new drugs to treat some of these major ailments that people are seeing.
Và nếu như mà trong tương lai chúng ta có thể chuyển đổi qua việc thí nghiệm trên các cái mô hình như trong cái video cuối cùng mà chúng tôi giới thiệu, thì khả năng là những cái kết quả thành công nó sẽ được cao hơn cái con số 10% mà chúng ta vừa nói. Và hy vọng là từ đó thì chúng ta có thể đưa ra những cái phương pháp điều trị nó hiệu quả hơn từ những cái thí nghiệm này đối với các cái bệnh mà con người đang gặp phải. Sorry, let's come to the third question. So, is it necessarily to use animal in veterinary research? And are there any alternative ways for the use of animals in veterinary research?
So, I guess this is for producing new drugs and to produce new methods to treat animal injuries, I guess. That's a more difficult one because, yes, we're looking at treating animals there rather than treating people. And so there's still a huge amount of medical research on animals to try to develop those drugs. As far as I'm aware, there is certainly, from a teaching perspective, there are lots of alternatives in terms of these simulator models of animals. So rather than having to have live animals, then people can be learning to carry out medical procedures on animal simulators, which have become very lifelike in recent years. And that's something which organisations like the University of Edinburgh and their animal welfare units have been promoting universities around the world to use more of. So I think there's a lot that we can do to reduce the number of animals which are used in research for veterinary advancement.
Câu hỏi của bạn là liệu có nhất thiết phải sử dụng động vật trong nghiên cứu thú y không, và có giải pháp thay thế nào không, thì tôi đoán rằng câu này hướng tới cái việc sử dụng các cái thí nghiệm để mà điều chế thuốc trong quá trình điều trị thú y, hoặc là trong quá trình chữa bệnh cho động vật. Thì đây là một cái vấn đề mà nó khác hoàn toàn, vì khi mà cái đối tượng là thí nghiệm là trên động vật và thí nghiệm các phương pháp điều trị trên chính các loài động vật đó, thì thực tế thì trên thế giới có một số cái trường đại học, ví dụ như đại học Edinburgh, họ cũng đã họ đang sử dụng họ đang quảng bá cái việc thay thế việc nghiên cứu trên động vật sống và bằng các cái mô hình động vật, và qua đó thì có thể là giảm được những cái đau đớn chịu đựng, hay giảm được những cái động vật phải trải qua cái quá trình thí nghiệm trực tiếp đó, và không sử dụng những cái động vật sống cụ thể.
But there's no reason why the same process for animals can't be the same as it is for people, as in we're already developing these organs on a chip, on a microchip, using human cells, culturing human cells to try to develop new drugs for people. There's no reason why we can't do exactly the same for animals. So we can culture cells which are specific to dogs or specific to rabbits or to mice, and then test on those cells. We can develop organs which are rabbit kidney organs or dog kidney organs or lungs, and test those. So I think that's probably where these alternatives will develop. So once we're using them more widely in humans, then hopefully that will shift to the development of similar approaches for specific species, which will then allow us to stop actually using the live animals in those tests as well for veterinary research.
Tuy nhiên là như chúng ta vừa tìm hiểu rằng là trên thế giới hiện tại đang có những cái mô hình sử dụng những cái chip máy tính, nó mô phỏng cái cách thức vận hành của các cái mô hay là các cái cơ quan khác nhau, và chúng ta hoàn toàn có thể sử dụng những cái hướng đó để hoặc là sử dụng những cái tế bào nuôi cấy, tế bào của một loài động vật như là thỏ hay chó, hay là một cái chuột chẳng hạn. Thì đây là những cái công nghệ mà hiện tại chúng ta có thể áp dụng được, và để xem được những cái phản ứng đối với mô của các cái loài khác nhau như thế nào. Đồng thời chúng ta cũng có thể sử dụng những cái sản phẩm, cái mô hình đó cho các cơ quan khác nhau, như mà cơ quan nội tạng như là tim hay là phổi của các loài động vật. Và khi mà chúng ta có tương lai mà các nhà nghiên cứu họ sử dụng phổ biến những cái mô hình như vậy ở trên con người, thì có thể họ sẽ thấy được cái kết quả và sẽ mở rộng, sẽ không chỉ giới hạn ở những cái thí nghiệm mô trên con người nữa, mà có thể mở rộng sang cho lĩnh vực thú y nữa. The next question is about Vietnam. Are there any facilities or institutes in Vietnam that use animals in research? And I see that many European countries now have banned the use of animal in testing in their countries. So they move to another country for testing models, animals, particularly in Asia and China. So did they move to Vietnam already? And because Vietnam do not have strong legislation to protect animals, making opportunity for company to do their test here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems that we have with working in specific areas, and that's why a global approach is much better. And I think again, organisations like Humane Society International are trying to adopt this much more global approach, because you're right. As soon as you start to convince the government to put more restrictions on the use of animals in a certain country, then what possibly happens is that research organizations just start to develop in different countries so that they don't have to go through that restrictive process. And I think we've seen that with the growth, particularly in China, of the use of animals in research and experimentation, with organizations which have traditionally maybe worked in Europe now operating from China, where they know that the legislation is much different. So it is really important for us to be able to work with countries globally to try to, one, develop much better regulations for the use of animals in research, but ultimately to try to convince governments to invest in that alternatives rather than investing more in the animal research.
Thank you. Có câu hỏi của bạn là ở Việt Nam thì có cơ sở động vật nào đang nghiên cứu mỹ phẩm một sản phẩm gia dụng không khi sử dụng động vật không? Và khi ở rất nhiều các quốc gia châu Âu thì họ đã cấm cái việc sự thí nghiệm trên động vật, và do đó một số doanh nghiệp họ chuyển qua các quốc gia khác ở châu Á, ví dụ như Trung Quốc chẳng hạn, và nơi họ chưa có nhà nước chưa đưa ra những cái quy định cấm này. Và đặc biệt là nếu ở Việt Nam thì cái quy định rất là lỏng lẻo. Thì câu trả lời của anh Dave là đó là lý do mà tại sao các cái tổ chức thường họ hoặc là các cá nhân thường là mà vận động mà trên cái quy mô quốc tế, thay vì chỉ tập trung vào một cái khu vực cục bộ nào đó. Thì đúng là như bạn nói là có rất nhiều các doanh nghiệp họ thấy rằng là cái việc thí nghiệm động vật nó bị cấm ở một khu vực nào hay một quốc gia nào, thì họ chuyển địa điểm tới những cái quốc gia khác. Và đó là những cái việc như các tổ chức như HSI họ vận động, và cái campaign, cái chiến dịch của họ nó bao trùm trên toàn thế giới. Và đó cũng là một cái lý do tại sao mà chúng ta cũng cần phải hướng tới cái việc vận động, hướng tới các sản phẩm thay thế các động vật sống trong thí nghiệm. Bởi vì là các quốc gia khác nhau thì họ không cấm, nhưng mà việc chúng ta vận động được cái sản phẩm thay thế thì nó đồng nghĩa với việc là các nhà thí nghiệm họ sử dụng cái sản phẩm đó, thay vì là chuyển đổi cái cơ sở của họ, di chuyển cái cơ sở của họ từ một quốc gia đang bị cấm sang một cái quốc gia khác, là một cái giống như một cái giải pháp để mà lách luật.
Specific to Vietnam, I'm not entirely sure whether companies have moved to Vietnam. And Tang, you probably know more, or you will know more than me about how much research is being done in Vietnam.
Với Việt Nam thì theo hiểu biết của chúng tôi thì cũng có các cái phòng thí nghiệm và các cái chương trình có thí nghiệm trên động vật và có sinh sản. Và Việt Nam cũng là một cái quốc gia mà cung cấp động vật thí nghiệm cho thế giới với một số cái loài, và cũng có hợp tác trong một số cái chương trình nghiên cứu với các quốc gia khác. Tuy nhiên với cái quy mô và của cái hoạt động thí nghiệm động vật ở Việt Nam thì hiện tại chúng tôi cũng có rất là ít thông tin, nên là cũng không đủ cái thông tin để cung cấp cho các bạn là cơ sở nào. Nhưng mà hiện tại thì có một số cơ sở mà nhà nước trước kia là có hợp tác với Nga chẳng hạn, hoặc là có từng xuất khẩu các loài khỉ qua châu Âu hoặc qua Mỹ, và hiện tại nó cũng vẫn đang diễn ra. Okay, the next question is are there any requirements for finding new home for former lapse animals? Because animals used in experiments can be psychologically affected and become aggressive and dangerous to humans.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know about the actual, whether there are any specific requirements. I guess really it just comes down to experts in terms of assessing animal behavior. And so animals which appear behaviorally to be acceptable for rehoming may have the opportunity to be rehomed. I think much more needs to be done with this at the moment. It's as far as I'm aware, there's very few animals which are really being taken away from a life of being used in experimentation and then being adopted into family homes. And you're right, it is going to be very difficult to do that in many cases because of a lot of the physical suffering, but also the psychological suffering that those animals have gone through. But it certainly doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't do it. And we owe it to those animals, if it's possible, to give them a good life after their life in a research laboratory. We should be providing them with that. But that would really come down to behavioural assessment of those individuals, and some of them will not be able to go into homes, and so yes, more likely to be euthanized, whereas others will still behaviorally be able to be rehabilitated and to live a normal life in a family home.
Câu hỏi bạn là việc tìm nhà mới cho những động vật đã từng làm động vật thí nghiệm thì có điều kiện nào không, và vì động vật sử dụng trong thí nghiệm thì có thể bị ảnh hưởng về tâm lý và trở nên hung hăng, gây nguy hiểm cho con người. Thì đây là một cái câu hỏi rất là hay, và tôi thì cá nhân tôi cũng không biết là có những cái quy định, các cái phòng thí nghiệm hay là có cái chương trình tìm nhà mới cho động vật đó thì nó có những cái quy định cụ thể nào, nhưng mà có cái điều kiện cụ thể nào. Tuy nhiên là nó thường cái quá trình này nó sẽ đòi hỏi cái sự tham gia của những chuyên gia về mặt hành vi đối với cái loài động vật đó, và để những chuyên gia đó họ xác định là những cá thể động vật nào nó có cái hành vi có thể phù hợp để tìm được chủ mới, và những cái cá thể nào mà nó không phù hợp thì sẽ vẫn bị tiêu hủy nhân đạo như cái quá trình nó vẫn diễn ra. Thì và chúng ta cũng phải thừa nhận một thực tế rằng là không phải động vật thí nghiệm nào đã trải qua thí nghiệm xong thì cũng có thể tìm được chủ mới. Thì, do đó là cái quá trình tìm đó thì dựa trên chủ yếu là về cái hành vi của con vật đó nó có phù hợp hay không. Is the next question is are there any agencies or organizations that is specialized in rescuing and rehoming former lab animals?
I don't actually know. I'm guessing then a lot of the organisations which are involved in rehoming animals, companion animals, really are the same organisations that are trying to work with laboratories to rehome, particularly domesticated animals like dogs and cats, and maybe some of the rabbits and rodents. But I don't know whether there's anybody who specifically looks at that as all that they do. I really just think it's the local shelters, the local animal welfare organisations which are working somewhere in a particular district where there is a research laboratory. Then some of those will possibly develop an association or a partnership with the research laboratory to say, can we come in and assess some of your animals after they've been used in research, so that we can then maybe bring them to our facility and then we can hopefully rehome them.
Có bạn đặt câu hỏi là hiện tại có cơ quan nào chuyên tiếp nhận cứu hộ động vật thí nghiệm hay không, thì cá nhân anh Dave cũng không có biết một cái tổ chức hay cơ quan nào họ chuyên thực hiện cái việc tiếp nhận cứu hộ này. Và hiện ở UK thì ở Anh thì anh ấy có thường là liên hệ và với một cái đơn vị cụ thể, và họ nói chung là khi họ có cái động vật cần tìm chủ mới hay nhà này, thì họ có thể giới thiệu đây là cái động vật mà đã từng làm đối tượng để thí nghiệm, nhưng mà họ cũng không phải là một cơ quan mà chuyên tiếp nhận hay cứu hộ động vật thí nghiệm. Thì cái việc mà tiếp nhận hay cứu hộ và tìm chủ mới cho những cái động vật thí nghiệm thì nó thường có lẽ diễn ra cục bộ hơn, khi mà ví dụ một nhóm cứu hộ động vật địa phương nào đó hay một đại học nào đó họ biết được rằng là có một cái nghiên cứu, có một cơ sở thí nghiệm ở trên địa bàn đó, và có thể chủ động liên hệ để trao đổi với ban lãnh đạo đó rằng đây là và rằng là sau khi mà những cái thí nghiệm đã thực hiện xong thì họ có thể tới để đánh giá xem những cá thể động vật nào có thể khả năng là có thể tìm được chủ mới, và trao đổi với đơn vị thí nghiệm đó để hai bên có thể được cho phép và hợp tác với nhau. Nó thường là diễn ra ở quy mô cục bộ hơn.
I think there's a rescue facility in America which specifically rehomes or has rehomed chimpanzees. So chimpanzee use in research is no longer, the chimpanzees are no longer used in research in Europe, they're no longer used in research in the United States. And there were a lot of chimpanzees which were in research laboratories 20, 30 years ago in the United States. And so I think there's a specific sanctuary which was set up in the United States specifically to take some of those chimpanzees and then provide them with a much better quality of life. And also some organizations took some of those chimpanzees back to Africa, where they could also be rehabilitated and looked after. And again, one of the leading organizations with the African example is the Humane Society of the United States, which from memory, I think they support about 65 rehabilitated chimpanzees in Liberia in Africa, which were former research animals in the United States that are now at least back in the country where they would have where they live naturally.
Và ở Hoa Kỳ thì chúng tôi được biết là có một đơn vị họ cũng có chú ý tới một cái loài động vật cụ thể là loài tinh tinh, vì tinh tinh được sử dụng trong các cái thí nghiệm trước kia khoảng 20 đến 30 năm trước thì người ta có sử dụng cái loài động vật này trong thí nghiệm, và bên đó thì chuyên tập trung vào cứu hộ các cái cá thể tinh tinh đó và xây dựng cả một cái khu vực bảo tồn cứu hộ cho cái loài đó. Và gần đây thì tổ chức Humane Society International HSI họ cũng có hợp tác với một số cái chính phủ hay là các cái chương trình để mà tái thả những cái cá thể tinh tinh đó về các quốc gia ở châu Phi, ví dụ như ở bên Libya, nơi mà trước kia những cái cá thể đó nó có là cái sinh cảnh sống tự nhiên của các loài đó. Thì đây là một trong những cái ví dụ nhưng mà nó chỉ cụ thể ở một cái loài tinh tinh đó thôi.
But again, the responsibility should really lie with the research organizations themselves to do this, and so it shouldn't be the responsibility of organizations like charities and dog and companion animal shelters that take on that responsibility. Really, the responsibility should lie with those which have used the animals. They should develop a process of rehoming those animals as part of their whole program of using animals, and then trying to put those animals into a much better situation. And I think that's something which again needs to be looked at in terms of the responsibility of the people which are using the animals, more so than passing that responsibility over to others to try to fundraise and try to carry out all of that huge amount of work to put these animals into better situations.
Tuy nhiên theo tôi thì cái việc mà tìm chủ mới hay tái thả những cái động vật thí nghiệm nó nên thuộc về cái trách nhiệm của các cái bên sử dụng động vật trong các thí nghiệm của họ, hơn là đá cái quả bóng trách nhiệm này qua những cái tổ chức hay những cái cá nhân khác để mà phải gây quỹ hay là phải tìm đủ mọi cách để có thể tìm một chủ mới hay là tái thả được những cái động vật là sản phẩm của cái ngành công nghiệp hay là cái hoạt động của họ. Và đây là chúng ta nên bằng cái cơ chế đó nên được giao trách nhiệm cho những cái cơ sở thí nghiệm động vật về cái trách nhiệm phải tìm chủ mới cho những cái động vật mà sau khi họ thí nghiệm xong mà còn có thể phù hợp để tìm chủ mới.
Các bạn còn câu hỏi nào muốn hỏi đến diễn giả của chúng ta không ạ?
That's all the questions that we have received. Now that Phương is calling for any question, like anyone wants to ask Dave, can unmute yourself and ask here.
Nếu như các bạn có câu hỏi nào thì các bạn có thể mở mic lên để có thể tự mình hỏi nhé. It seems like there's no more question.
Okay.
I know that Dave have some rats, former lab rats rescued. Can you tell the audience about them and how many and how are they and the names actually?
Yeah, I have. We currently have 12 rats. Not all of them are from laboratories, just 4 of them which were come from an ex-laboratory. The others were actually bred for a laboratory, but were given didn't end up in the laboratory. They went to a sanctuary beforehand, and then we ended up taking them. And yeah, they're just like any other animals. They're in a much more extensive environments. You know, they've got access to each other, social connections, building social bonds, and yeah, they're very happy. You know, they appear to be, you know, in very good health, fortunately, and you know, hopefully will live out the rest of their lives with us. Rats don't live very long anyway, unfortunately, only a couple of years lifespan. So you know, we we've had quite a lot of rats over the years, and they come and they go, but ultimately, yeah, these guys are living very happily as a group of 12 in an environment which we can provide for them, which is as close as possible to what they might see as something which is, you know, giving them as much, allowing them to carry out as much of their natural behaviors as possible.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Dave. Anh Dave thì cũng có một cứu hộ một số cái con chuột đã từng là trong các phòng thí nghiệm, đã từng sử dụng trong phòng thí nghiệm, và anh ấy hiện tại gia đình anh đang cứu mang 12 cá thể chuột, và chỉ có 4 cá thể trong số 12 đó thì đã từng là chuột thí nghiệm, và 8 con còn lại thì đã từng được sinh sản để mục đích là cho cái mục đích thí nghiệm, tuy nhiên là đã được cứu hộ. Và những cái động vật này thì cái tuổi thọ nó không dài, nó chỉ được vài năm tuổi thôi, và anh ấy cũng cung cấp cho nó những cái môi trường mà tốt nhất hoặc là phù hợp nhất đối với cái loài của nó, trong cái bối cảnh nó có thể sống chung với nhau, vì đây là một cái loài sống cộng đồng và sống theo một nhóm bầy đàn ấy, thì anh ấy cũng có ghép chung cái nhóm với nhau, và hiện tại thì cả nhóm này đang sống khá là khỏe mạnh. Và không chỉ cái nhóm này, và trong nhiều năm thì anh Dave cũng cứu hộ rất là nhiều các cái nhóm chuột khác nữa, các cá thể chuột khác, và rất nhiều động vật chuột đã được cứu hộ. Ngoài ra thì anh cũng cứu hộ cả những cá thể gà. Thông tin bên lề theo chúng tôi biết là gà từ các cái trang trại đã từng nuôi nữa thôi. And you also rescue farm animals, chicken from farms, like from egg-laying hens?
Yeah, we don't have any at the moment, but yeah, we've rescued. I've actually been involved in rescuing about 10,000 hens from egg-laying farms. So these are when the hens come to the end of their egg-laying cycle. So after a couple of years, then the egg production starts to go down, and generally farmers will send those hens to slaughter and then repopulate their farm with younger hens for a couple of years. And so some of those farmers have started to work with organizations which will allow people to take them and have them as pets. And so, yeah, we've actually helped to rescue about 10,000 hens from egg-laying farms, and then help to distribute them to various people that can look after them. And we've had quite a lot of those ourselves as well. And again, you know, they live relatively good lives. They go similar to laboratory animals. They've had a lot of stress in their life, so therefore they often succumb to ailments, physical ailments, maybe because of what's happened to them previously. It's not always possible to know, but ultimately, yeah, they can live, you know, a very good life, at least for a few years, outside of farms, as well as animals that are in laboratories can live a good life outside of the laboratory for a number of years. And I think, you know, because we put them through so much in terms of their mental suffering and in often their physical suffering, then we do at least owe them an opportunity to live a decent life for a number of years.
That's great. Anh Dave thì cũng có cứu hộ rất là gà đã từng là nuôi trong các trang trại đẻ gà đẻ trứng, và sau một vài năm thì thông thường là các cái chủ trang trại họ thay thế một cái lứa gà đó bằng cái lứa gà mới, và anh đã từng hợp tác để mà rehome, tìm chủ mới cho 10.000 cái gà trong một cái trang trại, và hiện tại vẫn đang thi thoảng làm những cái công việc đó. Thì đây là những cái cá thể này thì hiện tại một số cá thể đã được anh ấy cứu hộ, và bây giờ tới thời điểm hiện tại này thì những cá thể đó đã qua đời rồi. Tuy nhiên là nó sau khi được cứu hộ thì gà thông thường trang trại 1-2 năm họ sẽ thay thế sau khi nó đẻ hết, khi người ta khai thác và gà nó cái sản lượng trứng nó giảm đi. Nhưng mà khi mà cứu hộ về các gia đình thì nó có thể sống thêm được một vài năm nữa trong cái điều kiện hạnh phúc và tốt đẹp hơn. Và cũng giống như những cái động vật thí nghiệm thì những cái cá thể động vật này nó cũng khá là dễ bị bệnh do những cái căng thẳng hay những cái điều kiện nó không phù hợp hay tồi tệ trước đó mà nó trải qua. Tuy nhiên là sau khi được điều trị thì nó cũng cái cuộc sống của nó cũng kéo dài, cũng tốt hơn. Và theo anh ấy thì con người thì có cái nợ những cái loài động vật đó về cái trách nhiệm về phải chăm sóc và cho những cái gì mà con người đã gây ra đối với động vật trong những quá trình mà chúng ta sử dụng và khai thác động vật. Thank you, Dave, very much for sharing with of your rescue animals and amazing stories.
Thanks, Tang. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope it's given people a bit more opportunity to explore a topic. This is quite a difficult topic because obviously, it causes a lot of animal suffering, but it potentially also leads to less human suffering as well through some of the medical advancements that have happened. And I think it's something which people need to look into in a lot more detail to learn more about what is happening and what are the potential future opportunities to move towards, particularly with these alternatives. And I think that's the exciting part, in that there really is a pathway to move away from using animals in research. We don't need to kind of get into the ins and outs of whether we should or we shouldn't use animals in research. We really just need to focus more on investing and supporting those alternatives, so that regardless of the debate about whether it's ethically right or wrong to use animals for our benefit, we can just move away from it and we can improve human health without having an impact on animals.
Anh Dave cũng có cảm ơn mọi người đã tham dự ngày hôm nay, và cái chủ đề ngày hôm nay nó chỉ là một cái khởi đầu cho rất nhiều những cái thông tin mà các bạn có thể tìm hiểu được về những cái khả năng, những cái tiềm năng trong cái việc thay thế trong việc sử dụng động vật trong các cái thí nghiệm hay trong các cái nghiên cứu. Và mặc dù là cái vấn đề này nó vẫn còn nó là cái chủ đề gây tranh cãi ở trong xã hội, và theo cá nhân anh ấy thì chúng ta thay vì tập trung vào những cái tranh cãi của cái việc là có nên hay không nên sử dụng động trong thí nghiệm, hay là những cái vấn đề đạo đức, thì thay vì thế chúng ta nên tập trung những cái nguồn lực của mình, năng lượng của mình vào trong việc khám phá hay là quảng bá những cái hướng thay thế mà không sử dụng, không liên quan đến động vật, hoặc không gây đau đớn cho động vật, thông qua những cái giải pháp về công nghệ hay những cái mô hình mà anh ấy có nói. Và nó có tiềm năng tạo ra những thay đổi về không chỉ về chất lượng các cái kết quả cho con người, mang lại sức khỏe cho con người, hiệu quả về kinh tế cho con người, mà nó có khả năng là mang lại giảm loại trừ được những cái đau đớn chịu đựng cho các loài động vật trong cái quá trình này nữa. Cảm ơn mọi người rất là nhiều. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thanks everybody.
Cảm ơn Hương.
Nếu như không có câu hỏi gì nữa thì mình xin phép kết thúc buổi chia sẻ ngày hôm nay tại đây nhé. So once again, thank you for joining. I hope you had a great weekend ahead. Cảm ơn các bạn. Cảm ơn anh Thanh, cảm ơn chị Tata đã hỗ trợ ạ. Xin chào mọi người.
Bye bye. Have a good weekend, everyone.